The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Liar, Lunatic, or Lord. As many of you know, I grew up a fundamentalist Southern Baptist Christian. From around the age of 5 or so, I walked down an aisle and got saved and was raised in the church and was active in the church. And one book that was kind of critical or formative in helping justify my beliefs and affirm that I had made a good decision was Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Now, this is only volume 1. He wrote a volume 2 and actually combined that into this book, which is the new Evidence That Demands a Verdict. There might be a super evidence that demands a verdict somewhere out there. But Josh McDowell's book is great, provided you already believe and provided you don't research beyond the surface. If you want more information, we're not going to be going through all of the evidence that demands a verdict in this video. But you can go to infidels.org and do a search, and there's a pretty good chapter by chapter, claim by claim deconstruction of this book. But I want to talk about what's behind this book, the question that needs to be addressed, the verdict that Josh McDowell is seeking that we make. Now, Josh was influenced, as many were, by C.S. Lewis. Most of us know C.S. Lewis from the Narnia series. This is my paperback copy, like first run paperback in 1970 or something. Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, etc. I've had these. I read them several times as a kid, loved them, held on to them. They're still in good shape. But he was also a Christian apologist and identified as a former atheist, although when he talked about his former atheism, he said he was mostly mad at God for not existing or something along those lines. But he wrote a book called Mere Christianity, and in that book, he first presents the liar, lunatic, Lord trilemma. Now, he wasn't the originator of this. There were probably other people who said this, but it became popular because of C.S. Lewis, and we're going to talk about that particular argument, and I thought I'd start by reading what C.S. Lewis said. I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He's not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Now, it seems to me obvious that he was neither a lunatic nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God. Now, C.S. Lewis is basically addressing something that comes from Mark chapter 8, verse 29, and it is also in the other gospel or the other synoptic gospels as well, where Jesus asked Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" We have to make some decision about the claims about this Jesus character. And C.S. Lewis's position is that there really are only 3 options. Either he was lying about who he was, or he was a lunatic, or he was who he said he was. So let's take a look at those options, see if perhaps we've excluded some options, and what kind of verdict can we actually make on this question. So the first thing that we can note is that liar, lunatic, and Lord are 3 potential options that we can consider here. But those are only the options if we make a couple of assumptions first. The first assumption being that this individual actually existed, was a historical figure. Now, I know that the bulk of historians and many researchers are generally of the opinion that Jesus did in fact exist as a historical character, and that the mythicists are generally disregarded. Now, mythicists fall into a couple of different categories. There are the relatively unscholarly conspiracy theorist-minded individuals who want to portray all of Christianity and the Jesus character as if it were an intentionally constructed fiction. And there are others that follow a more organic process that say, perhaps there was an individual or some individuals or a collection of individuals. We just don't know. We have a bunch of source material. We have people copying from each other. I'm not here to make a case that Jesus didn't exist. I'm firmly in the camp that we could go ahead and concede that he existed, and it gets us nowhere. It doesn't tell us anything at all about the character of the individual or the actual words that were said, because the recordings that we have are the Gospels, which are anonymous. We don't know who wrote the Gospels. The general consensus is that they're not eyewitnesses, that these weren't written by the people who were actually there with Jesus, but we could actually concede that they were written by eyewitnesses, and we still aren't any closer to knowing whether or not we have an accurate representation of this individual, what his words were, and what his deeds are. There's simply too many questions. We don't have anything from Jesus himself. We have hearsay accounts. Now, they tend to line up, but they almost line up too good in some areas and incredibly poorly in others. There's lots of difficulties in trying to reconcile the Easter accounts and other things like that. But my position here on liar, lunatic, or Lord does not hinge on the assertion that Jesus didn't exist. I'm just pointing out that given that we don't have certitude about this, given that there is some question, we could concede that he existed and still perhaps not have a good record of his words and deeds. Even if we had a fairly good record of his words and deeds, that doesn't necessarily lead us to the conclusion that liar, lunatic, and Lord are the only options available. We can grant all of that. We can grant that Jesus existed and that the Gospels are generally accurate without taking away options beyond liar, lunatic, or Lord. On that front, we can start with liar and ask ourselves, do we have a good reason to think that Jesus was lying? Well, considering that he didn't expressly say, I am the Lord thy God, the arguments for Jesus claiming that he was God basically amount to his making himself synonymous with God in having an authority to forgive sins, specific language before Abraham was, I am, the verb context, and making it seem that he's eternal, not correcting Peter when he says, who do you say that I am? And Peter says that you're the Christ, and then, hey, don't tell anybody. All of these things together make it clear Christianity is founded on the idea that Jesus was God incarnate, and his words and deeds represented this, even if he didn't say, I am God incarnate. People will ask sometimes, well, who are you to question God? And this is a bit of a defense mechanism, which I've already discussed. And I'd like to point out a comment that was made by others that I think is far better than what I said, which is I'm not questioning God. I'm questioning people. I'm questioning people's claims about God. I'm questioning the authors of the Gospels. I'm wondering, are they reliable? Are they giving me information? I don't have to say that Jesus was necessarily lying if all I have are what the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote about Jesus as far as his words. I'm questioning them. I'm questioning how accurately they recorded things. But it could be the case that either of them are in fact lying. I don't know that that's necessarily an absurdity. Well, it's just rude to think that someone is lying. Hume taught us to consider whether or not the person telling us an extraordinary tale is more likely to have been deceived or is intending to deceive than that what they're claiming is actually true, and that we should reject the greater miracle. Now, I'm rejecting the greater miracle that he was in fact God, but I don't have to make a decision between whether he was lying or had been deceived, or whether the people who are relaying this information were lying or had been deceived. As a matter of fact, because we're one step removed from the actual author, I think it's entirely plausible that the individuals who are relaying the information may have been deceived. They may have been incorrect. They may have misunderstood. They may not have had accurate access to the information and relayed it. We know eyewitness testimony is unreliable. And in this case, we're not even sure that we have eyewitness testimony. If somebody comes to me and says, I saw a ghost last night, my immediate assumption is not that they're lying, it's that they're mistaken. If they bothered to come and tell me this story and they know that I'm going to think that it's outlandish, unless they have some motivation for lying to me, and I suspect a motivation, my assumption is that they had some experience, and in their mind they have determined that a ghost is the best descriptor for this experience. But that doesn't mean that they were correct about what they actually experienced. And they can relay this story many times. We see it with alien abductees and others. So the fact that someone isn't saying something that is true doesn't mean that they're necessarily lying. Lying tends to rely on an intent to deceive. I'm trying to trick you. Otherwise, anytime anybody was just wrong about something, we would have justification for calling them a liar. But what about lunatic? So when it comes to the possible claim that he was a lunatic, C.S. Lewis just disregards it. He disregards liar without any justification, really, and he disregards lunatic without any justification. He just says, I think it's absurd, essentially, to claim that he was either lying or crazy, so he must be God. Well, I'm not necessarily convinced that it's absurd to disregard liar, and I'm also not convinced that it's absurd to disregard lunatic. We know that there are people with mental illnesses who still are lucid on occasion, who have great charisma, who have become leaders of cult movements, where seemingly normal, non-mentally deficient individuals have been caught up in cult movements run by people who we would say are perhaps deranged. Now, some of them were liars. Some of them seem to have believed the stuff that they said. We know of a number of mental illnesses where people can have delusions, and we also know that just being a human being makes you prone to errors. And in much the same way that when we investigate the supposed psychics who claim to be getting messages from the other side, some of them who started off as knowing frauds eventually come to believe their own BS. You just get so many hits that you fall into a confirmation bias that, wow, maybe I actually do have this sort of power. And there are also people who have incredibly good intentions for changing the world who ultimately encourage bad behavior. That's their goal, is to try to make the world better, and some things are worth it. Now, when you take the totality of what's written about Jesus in there, I don't see anything that necessarily excludes lunatic as a possible option for this. When he talks, it's both as someone trying to be a nurturing guide, but sometimes he's portrayed as a revolutionary, and sometimes he's portrayed as violent, making a scourge and attacking the temple. I don't know that there's any neat, clean package of what Jesus is that necessarily excludes the diagnosis, or the verdict, I guess, for lack of a better word, that he was a lunatic of some sort. There seems to be this view that it's rude to say that somebody's lying, and it's rude to say that somebody's a lunatic, when we know that people lie. And we know that someone could be suffering from delusions and not be completely over the top to where we need to put them in a rubber room. You know, drooling from the mouth and babbling incoherently is not the only manifestation of someone with mental issues. But I don't necessarily know that I have enough to conclude that he was lying, and I don't necessarily have enough to conclude that he was a lunatic. I'm not as convinced that, as C.S. Lewis was, that these are excluded, but I can't firmly be convinced of either one of them. In part because I'm still not convinced that I know anything about who he actually was, because we're getting secondhand reports. Perhaps the individuals who had a motive to relay this information and a desire for people to believe them because they thought they were doing good, maybe they had been deceived. Maybe they were delusional. We don't know. But C.S. Lewis would like us to think that the only remaining option is that he was Lord. Now, there's been a number of debates about whether or not Jesus actually claimed to be God, and we already talked about that a little bit earlier. But what would it take to convince us that someone was in fact God? If we set up liar, lunatic, and Lord, and we were convinced that those were the only three options, would merely not being convinced of liar and lunatic be sufficient for us to say, yep, must be God? We'd need a lot more than secondhand hearsay reports of ancient events to say, yeah, you know what, I don't think that person was crazy and I don't think they were lying, so they must be God. As if these writings on their own should be sufficient to make you believe the incredibly extraordinary claim that an individual was a deity. Extraordinary claims, as we're all aware, require extraordinary evidence. And if we were to accept this claim based on the evidence that were presented by Josh McDowell and others, we would be lunatics. We would be credulous. We would be poor representatives of critical thinking. Because if we're to be honest, we would have to then start accepting all sorts of other claims from other people. We would have to say, you know what, this person over here who claims to be Jesus now, I'm not really necessarily convinced they're a liar. I'm not really convinced they're a lunatic, so they must be right. Or these other holy men who claim to be divine in other religions. We would have to believe them too because, well, we have similar justification. We have writings in old books, hearsay accounts from people. That's not enough, and it shouldn't be enough. At a bare minimum, given those three options and the available evidence, the verdict is that the case should be thrown out for lack of evidence. The verdict should be, I cannot conclude that this individual is Lord, lunatic, or liar. I cannot even be completely convinced that this individual existed and is represented in a way that I know much about them. So we're stuck with this trilemma. And if C.S. Lewis were right, we would be sitting here probably forever. And the only thing we could say is, I really can't make a decision. But it's possible that there's at least one more option to consider. So I don't find any compelling reason to think that he's God. As if he was, this would be trivial to demonstrate. We wouldn't need to be having arguments about it. We wouldn't need to be learning dead languages and poring over old texts and trying to make arguments that, well, he couldn't have been crazy. He couldn't have been lying, so he must have been God. It would be obvious. It'd be available to everybody. The silence is damning and deafening. I'm okay with the possibility that this individual was lying or people were lying on his behalf. I'm okay that this individual could have been deceived and that people were deceived in a continuation and that there may not have been some nefarious attempt by them to intentionally deceive others. They could have just been thinking that they were passing on good information. I'm fine with the possibility that the individual was deranged, that they were a lunatic, or that the people who followed may have had delusions as well, that there's a complex mix of possible solutions here. But I have to reject the greater miracle that he was Lord. But there's a fourth option that Lewis ignores. And to be honest, I think this is the reason why Josh McDowell and others have spent so much time trying to set up a foundation, because they're trying to exclude the option that I think is preferable. And it's going to come as a surprise to very few of you. But there's a fourth L: liar, lunatic, Lord, or legend. Now, a legend is a traditional story sometimes popularly regarded as historical but unauthenticated. That seems to me to be exactly what we have in the story of Jesus. A popular story, sometimes regarded as historical, but unauthenticated. The story of his birth, his ministry, his death, and resurrection are all stories from Christian tradition that aren't backed by evidence outside of the biblical tradition. The apologists have spent countless years trying to comb the world and scour every ancient manuscript and piece together a story so that there's a foundation upon which all of this rests, so that no one can honestly claim legend as an option. C.S. Lewis didn't even seem to address legend, at least not anything I've read from him. Perhaps he addressed it in a context after his famous Trilemma gained popularity. But for me, legend is the obvious current winner, given any new information, barring any new evidence for the claim. A legend describes Jesus to a T. We have outlandish stories that are extraordinary in the deeds and actions. These can't be confirmed. They're not reproduced. They are beyond what the ordinary individual could do. They could be the result of people being deceived or engaging in self-deception. They could be in part the result of delusions. We might have a little bit of lying, a little bit of self-deception, a little bit of lunatic, and all of this together combined becomes legend. Now, I know that there are people that are just going to be completely unconvinced. Oh, it can't be a legend. It can't be. Of course it couldn't be a legend. How absurd. How can you come up with a legend? Why, just look at all the evidence. I have. So have a lot of other people. That's why I pointed out that you can go to infidels.org and you can get a chapter by chapter refutation of Josh McDowell's evidence that demands a verdict. And people have been having these arguments for years. What extra biblical contemporary accounts do we have that tell us anything at all about Jesus? Nothing. All of the tales come 30, 40, 50, 70, 100, 200 years later, and now we're talking not just hearsay, but hearsay about hearsay. It was once put that the Bible is a collection of oral traditions that were written down, and we have copies of translations of copies. And if this were true for any other claim, people wouldn't be running around saying, oh, it's absurd to think this is legend. The reason people think it's absurd that it's a legend is because they already believe it. And if you start with the belief, you will find ways to make the evidence fit the belief. This is what I think evidence that demands a verdict is doing. This is what I think C.S. Lewis is doing when he was a former atheist who was mad at God for not existing. And then he reads what Jesus is purported to have said. He comes to the conclusion that, well, he can't be lying and he can't be a lunatic because he says so many wonderful things. The only remaining option, no matter how surprising or terrible it may be, is that he is in fact God. And that's because C.S. Lewis poisoned the well by excluding the possibility that Jesus was a legend.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.